So the crew leader training program has been broken into essentially three different sections or overall like chapters, if you will. So a day in the life is meant to walk you through a specific day and kind of how that follows all the way from the night before to the end of that day. Um, the next chapter would be situational, so things that you might encounter and essentially how to deal with them out on the job. And then the final one is theoretical. So that goes over different things that might be a little bit more indirectly tied to what we're doing out in the job. And it's still good to make note of them so that you can recognize them and you can learn from them versus having to do it the hard way. But essentially, that's kind of the way we're breaking apart the Crew Leader Handbook, as well as this video series that follows the Crew Leader Handbook. So starting with a day in the life, we want to go through work orders and tell you about them, because essentially what the work order does is it takes all the information that we presented to the customer on their quote, and it creates it in a format where you then can receive it and you know where to go, what to do, how long it should take, and all the other elements to do with that job. It is super important that we follow it directly, because if you do anything more or anything less, you might not be meeting the expectations of the customer. Another important thing to recognize with the work orders is if it is the case that, say, less is done because of the customer's request, it's super, super important that you make note on your job sheet. The reason for this is the quote becomes the work order, becomes the invoice. The invoice is basically the document that says, we did this thing, please pay us this amount of money. Now, the line items that you see on each of the documents, so the quote might say window cleaning, becomes the work order, so it might say window cleaning. But then if we get to the job and Mrs. Smith says, you know what, you're here to do window cleaning, which is great, but can you also do gutter cleaning? Well, that line item is not there, and it's super, super important that we make note of that, or else we're not going to charge the customer for having done that job. So again, if anything gets added or subtracted from your work order, your original work order, make sure you note it on your job sheet. It's super, super important. From there, in your your crew leader handbook, we have this really handy chart that basically goes over what a standard work order looks like. Now, generally speaking, you'll receive your next day's work orders around before probably about 5 p.m. the day prior. And at that time, it's super important that you open it up, you read through it, make sure that it all makes logical sense, and you understand essentially what is being asked of each specific job. It's always a good idea then to take those addresses and to just quickly Google them, and you can do the Google Street View where the little person gets dragged onto the map and you can kind of pan around and look at the specific home or the strata or the business that you'll be working at, just so that you have that added level of confidence. Generally speaking, the rock stars on our team, which are the A players, the top performers, they'll do all of this prior to showing up in the morning. And the reason is they will feel that much more confident. They'll know exactly what they need in terms of the equipment or the special gear. And finally, they'll be able to ask questions if they're at all unsure of anything that's being requested on the work order. And you know what? The people in the office are only human, and on occasion, there might be something that's completely contradictory or that was an honest error or a mistake. And if you just kind of head down, open it up for the first time as you're on your way, you're kind of just at the disposal of whatever will happen, and you're really not in control with that approach. So if you can be preemptive when you receive your work order the night before, do a little bit of panning around on Google to make sure that it all makes sense, then that's basically the first step to a super efficient and effective day. Bear in mind with the work order here, the start time is always an approximate time that we communicate through the booking confirmation email. Sometimes we'll get a customer that doesn't read the booking confirmation email properly, and they'll wonder why we're not there at that specific time. So if that happens, it's important for you to know kind of why they're in that headspace. But essentially, if it's 8 or 9 a.m., we'll tell them in the booking confirmation, we'll be there on this day in the morning. Or if it's 1 p.m., it'll be the early afternoon, something like that. But we leave it intentionally vague just because the jobs later on throughout the day, our arrival time is totally dependent on how we do throughout the earlier portions of the day or the earlier jobs of the day. So that's why we try and be intentionally vague when it comes to communicating arrival time. The end time does not matter. Totally disregard it. Unfortunately, our system makes us put one in, but it could be midnight for all we care. It does not matter, and nothing else really refers to that end time. So you don't have to worry about it. The job number is clearly displayed, job number 10567, and you're going to use that number on while you're filling out your job sheet so that the office can reference what the paperwork pertains to. Past that, you're going to have a neighborhood code. So essentially for us, route density is what it's called. Basically having jobs close to one another is super, super important because it's the difference between driving back and forth, zigzagging all over town, or doing a bunch of very closely located jobs in an efficient amount of travel time, and ultimately being able to get through a lot more work in general. From there, you're going to have the services to be done, and we abbreviate those. At the end of the Crew Leader Handbook, there's a glossary that essentially defines what each of those services to be done looks like. And then if you ever see something in the description that says like C notes or a star with like WFP for a water-fed pole, it's really important that you recognize those types of shout outs. And in the case of C notes, it's quietly listed at the bottom, but generally speaking, it's really important information. And what you don't want to do is be that person that has to contact your coordinator only to ask for something that's already on your work order, because effort was taken to provide you with this information. So the least we can do as crew leaders out in the field is make sure that we totally are aware of it, and we're basing our questions on the assumption that we already have that knowledge that was provided to us. Aside from that, our glossary will go over everything else that you can see here, but it's all relatively straightforward stuff, and it should basically prepare you with the description of how to do the job, where to do the job, if there's any limitations. Sometimes we are only asked to do the higher windows or the lower windows or what have you, but essentially it should be detailed enough so that you can go out and do the job efficiently and effectively.